night, soulmates. I'm Richard Fowler.
I'm Jehmu Greene.
And I'm Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey.
And welcome to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. In just 30 minutes from now, the House Select Committee investigating the January 6th Capitol attack of the United States will begin its first series of primetime hearings. With America divided, these hearings will seek to convince the nation that former President Donald Trump's claims of a stolen election incited his followers to violently invade the Capitol and interrupt the peaceful transfer of power.
Chairing these primetime hearings and the Select Committee is the Mississippi Congressman and Chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, Benny Thompson, who is also a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, where he has been a member since 1993. Tonight, Congressman Thompson and his committee plan to draw a straight line between the criminal conspiracy invasion of the Capitol and former President Trump.
For the past 11 months, the committee has worked behind closed doors as other major issues have beset the American people: inflation, gun violence, racism, and the remnants of COVID-19. So the question becomes, can tonight's hearing refocus the minds of the American people on something that happened almost 2 years ago?
There's so much to unpack here. And what we know thus far about tonight's hearing is this. The committee will unveil 10 minutes of unseen footage. We'll also hear testimony from a documentary film producer, Nii Quartelai, who was embedded with the Proud Boys. And we'll hear from Capitol Police Officer Carolyn Edwards. Now, if you remember correctly, last year, the committee held a public hearing to recount law enforcement's experience during that horrific day. Take a listen to what Officer Harry Dunn had to say about his experience on January 6th.
More and more insurrectionists were pouring into the area by the speaker's lobby near the rotunda, and some wearing MAGA hats and shirts that said Trump 2020. I told them to just leave the Capitol, and in response they yelled, "No, man, this is our house. President Trump invited us here. We're here to stop the steal. Joe Biden is not the president. Nobody voted for Joe Biden." I'm a law enforcement officer, and I do my best to keep politics out of my job. But in this circumstance, I responded, "Well, I voted for Joe Biden. Does my vote not count? Am I nobody?" That prompted a torrent of racial epithets. One woman in a pink MAGA shirt yelled, "You hear that, guys? This voted for Joe Biden." Then the crowd, perhaps around 20 people, joined in screaming, "Boo!" No one had ever called me a while wearing the uniform of a Capitol Police officer. In the days following the attempted insurrection, other Black officers shared with me their own stories of racial abuse on January 6th. One officer told me he had never, in his entire 40 years of life, been called a to his face, and that streak ended on January 6th. Yet another Black officer later told me he had been confronted by insurrectionists in the Capitol who told him, "Put your gun down and we'll show you what kind of you really are." To be candid, the rest of the afternoon is a blur. But I know I went throughout the Capitol to assist officers who needed aid and help expel more insurrectionists.
Wow, that is compelling testimony. And I've got to tell you, there are two things that really jump out at me. One, not even his Capitol Police uniform could protect him from the white supremacist violence on the steps of the Capitol. And two, how can anyone listen to testimony like that of Officer Dunn and some of the other folks that have been before the committee and not see that this insurrection was motivated by white supremacy? How can they not see that this was a desperate attempt to overthrow our government and interrupt the peaceful transfer of power? What say you, Richard? Jehmu?
Well, it's hard even listening to listening to him now, a year and a half later, that is still a very difficult description to picture. And I think that's especially why Black voters are wanting to see Congress hold these criminal conspiracists who did this accountable. They have an understanding that there is a direct link between the white supremacy that led to 10 Black people being killed in Buffalo and to the people who stormed the Capitol back in January 6th. All of these things are connected, and they're looking for accountability.
I think that's right. What I would add to that is, I mean, when you hear this officer, Dunn, talk about the uniform didn't protect him from white supremacy, I think that really does spill over into the American electorate. And if you look at all the reporting of how sort of unenthused, or maybe a better word, unplugged Black voters are right now, this is why. They feel like in 2020, they went out in record numbers to vote for a new government. And what they're getting in return is nothing, right? And I think as a result of that, while these hearings are happening tonight, I think Black voters are looking in their kitchen cabinets, like you said, Nii Quartelai. They're looking at inflation. They're looking at gas prices. They're looking at the sort of remaining impacts of COVID-19, and they're saying, yes, we know January 6th happened. Based on a lot of polling, a lot of African Americans expected violence to happen after the election. And so like we knew this was going to happen anyway. We tried to tell you. And here it is. And now we're having a hearing about it, things that we already knew. But what happened to the change that we asked for? What happened to the George Floyd Policing Act? What happened to voting rights protection?
Richard, I have to add that it's not that they're getting nothing. What we are getting is actually people who supported this criminal invasion back on January 6th are now rewriting laws to make it harder for people to have the freedom to vote. They have actually gained power when you look at who is actually pulling back on our voting rights. These are people who supported January 6th. Absolutely.
And I think that's right. And it's not just voter suppression, but it's also these anti-protest bills that Republican-controlled legislatures across the country have been quietly passing as well. And so, it kind of makes you wonder, especially coming out of Tuesday's election and places like California, New Jersey, where public safety was very much on the minds of voters and will continue to be on the minds of voters between now and November. One of the challenges for this committee is, how can they elicit a level of compassion for law enforcement when in many places across the country, law enforcement has been sort of, anti-change in the status quo.
I think that's right, Dr. Quartey, and I'll add to that. I think if you talk to people, and I've done so many interviews and so much reporting, not only about law enforcement, but also just what's happening in Black communities. And it's not that African Americans are anti-law enforcement. They want law enforcement to actually do some work, right? They want law enforcement to go find illegal guns in their community. There's not one African American that I've interviewed over the past 2 years that want lawlessness in their community. They actually, they're believers in the ideal of public safety. And what they see in their community is they see over policing, but they don't see police solving or stopping crime. And my hope is, as this committee sort of has their hearing today, hope they draw a direct line between what the testimony of Officer Dunn and the idea that if we support law enforcement, maybe law enforcement will do the job they need to be doing in communities to make sure that crime doesn't continue to happen. Now, I do believe, and I'll say this, and I'll say it again, and I'll continue to say it, I do think that this committee has a very, 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 very sort of high mountain to climb tonight, right? Because I think for a lot of Americans, especially for a lot of folks watching us tonight, January 6th happened almost 2 years ago, and they've moved on with their life, right? And now this committee is trying to bring this back in focus. And as they bring this back in focus, the question now becomes, will this matter to the American public? Will this matter to the American electorate? Will this have an impact on the midterm elections? And will this have an impact on everyday life for Americans?
I think we have to understand that it matters because, again, look at those links between the voting rights that are being pulled back to the people who were behind the criminal conspiracy on January 6th, to the people who are pushing replacement theory, which led to the shooter going to Buffalo and killing 10 Black people. all of this is connected. All of the groups driving these messages are connected. That's why.
There's no question, Jehmu. I agree that they're connected. The question is can this committee make the line so clear that there's no American that could doubt it? We're going to have to wait to see. And while we're waiting to see, we're going to take a quick break. And right after this break, we'll hear from Congressman Hank Johnson of Georgia. Hopefully you'll stay with us.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's live coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Joining us now to give his account of that dreadful day is Congressman Hank Johnson. Welcome, Representative Johnson.
So
while we wait for Congressman Johnson, Richard, why don't we continue the discussion we were just having?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the witnesses that we're going to hear from tonight, Jehmu, is British filmmaker Nii Quartelai. And what makes this so interesting, and I found this to be very interesting as I was reading about his history earlier today, is that Nii Quartelai was actually embedded with the Proud Boys. He's been embedded with the Proud Boys for a couple of months, and he was actually with them in the Capitol with his cameras. He's already been deposed by the committee and the Justice Department. And he will not only will he see his footage tonight, but we will also hear his testimony tonight. And I think we're seeing more and more of this information coming out. We found out also that, there was phone records into the Willard Hotel. But what we'll hear specifically from him is we'll see some footage from him, and he'll be telling firsthand knowledge of what the Proud Boys were doing the day of. I mean, Dr. Quartey, as somebody who has followed January 6th, you wrote about it for the Griot. What do you think about this new witness that was literally had his cameras rolling as the Proud Boys invaded the United States Capitol?
I mean, I think it's going to be a tremendous opportunity to offer the American people insights into the psychology of this white supremacist group. I think for so many generations of Americans, when we think about white supremacist groups, we think about the KKK, for example. And of course, there are organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center that do an amazing job tracking hate groups focus on all different communities across the country. But I think it's important for the American people to understand, how do the Proud Boys think? How do they operate? What are their goals? It's not just overturning our government or interrupting the peaceful transfer of power, but what do we need to be on the lookout for, not just in Washington, but in state houses across the country? How much has the Proud Boys and their ideology metastasized across the country?
And now we are thrilled to be able to have this conversation with Congressman Hank Johnson. Welcome to Fox Soul's coverage of the January 6th hearing, Congressman. We're thrilled to have you.
Well, it's so wonderful to be with you all.
And we'd love to know, what are your thoughts on the investigation so far? My understanding is that there was a lot of testimony that your members, your colleagues heard that was quite new and quite even more shocking than the video that we've all seen.
Yeah, so there will be video footage that we have not seen that I think we will see tonight. And we may get a glimpse of some of the 1,000 interviews of people that the committee completed, deposed these folks. And so there's a lot of information that is out there that we do not know about. And I'm expecting these hearings to reveal that information. And tonight is the beginning of a series, I believe, of 6 hearings throughout the remainder of the month. And I expect that these hearings will be quite revealing about the extent to which people went to overthrow our democracy by interfering with the Electoral College vote compilation in the Senate and in the House in an effort to overthrow the results of an election, the popular vote and the Electoral College vote. And so this conspiracy began, by the way, before January 6th. It's going to focus, of course, on the events of January 6th, but I think even more importantly are the events that were the prelude to January 6th.
2 questions for you, Representative Johnson, and thanks for joining us. One, with regard to Chair Benny Thompson, how do you think he's been doing as chair of the committee? This has been a very heavy lift.
I think he has done a superb job. I am so impressed with the level-headedness of his leadership of this committee. He is a man who knows a whole lot more than what he has told us, but yet he has offered us morsels that were appropriate to be shared at the time. And I think the committee members have been very strategic in terms of what they have said, because after all, these witnesses who they have called before them have been listening. And so they have gotten a glimpse of what knowledge the committee has, and that has acted to perhaps cause them to be more honest in their presentations before the committee, because of course, it is against the law to lie to Congress.
My question for you, Congressman. So your district is in Georgia, and Georgia has sort of been the bedrock, not only for many of the voter suppression laws and many of these, critical race theory laws we've seen passed, but it's also going to be the battleground for the midterm elections. And so as this committee gets ready to sort of have its first primetime hearing, what impact do you think will have for your constituents? I mean, is this going to motivate them to go out to the polls, or will this just be another congressional hearing?
Well, I tell you, I just came from the store, and I talked with 3 people at the store, and they asked me, what's going to happen tonight? And they were, I don't want to say excited, but they were intent on watching these hearings, starting with tonight. I would say that there was a level of excitement to finally get the full story of what happened. And I think people, they know based on what they've heard that former President Trump was at the head of a grand conspiracy, and they want to know the details. They're anxious to learn more details about it, because after all, we get bits and pieces in the press every evening, kind of like highlights. But the people are in my district are looking to go deeper into this thing. They kind of craving for more information. So I think that these hearings will be well attended from a virtual standpoint. We can't actually be in the hearing room, America. But just like the Watergate hearings, people are going to be looking and watching and listening and drawing their own conclusions. And it's not going to be a pretty picture when when the canvas is completed. Donald Trump and his minions in the Republican Party will be exposed for exactly who they are. And that is people who are willing to do anything to claim and cling to power.
So, Congressman, talking about those details, you're a survivor of this Capitol Hill attack. Can you just walk us through what happened for you that day?
Well, I mean, I'm sitting in the Capitol, up in the gallery, up on the 3rd floor, overlooking the House floor, along with maybe 50 of my colleagues. And we were all kind of in the same section, though socially distanced. And everyone was kind of watching the proceedings. And of course, you're monitoring your cell phone. Some folks had their iPads out. And just a normal, situation where we came to observe what should have been kind of like a solemn and routine process. But as we got further into it, we heard noise on the outside, disruptive noise, and it seemed that the noise continued to escalate. And then at the same time, you're looking at your device and you're seeing reports coming over about the Capitol being invaded, and you're starting to put things together that these folks are right outside of our door. And we have not had any advanced knowledge of it. We're just sitting here. And so, what happened was they ended up locking those doors and corralling us to move to the opposite side of the gallery. And that caused a lot of headache for the older people that on your face mask, for the tear gas that they said to expect. And it was kind of a chaotic situation up there where you just didn't know what was going to happen. We were the last people to actually leave the floor of the Capitol. And when I got a chance to be outside and I saw the numbers of people who were spread eagled on the floor being held at gunpoint by Capitol Hill police officers, it was, but to hear that gunshot, when that gunshot went off, that was a crucial moment, kind of brought everybody into a more, it was very serious, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And so it was a lot of relief when we were able to finally leave the gallery, walk down the stairs and into a safe zone.
And thank you so much for reliving that, as hard as it may be, because I think we all have to remember just how close we came to that day. Congressman, you said something I think that was so important about what events led up to January 6th. We can't forget that President Trump said to the Proud Boys, which we were just talking about, stand back, stand down. We can't forget that this goes back to 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, when President Trump at the time said that there were very good people on both sides when there were white supremacists marching in the streets in Charlottesville and led to the death of one of the peaceful protesters. Congressman, as we look at all of these things and certainly President Trump's culpability in this, what are the options for this committee, for the Americans as we look at this and learn the new evidence that we'll see? What are the options for accountability? What comes next? After the testimony, how does Congress hold those responsible accountable?
Well, this committee and Congress, neither of them have the ability or the authority to prosecute these individuals who will be shown to have been engaged in a seditious conspiracy to overthrow our democratic process. But I think, I know that it's important that the story be told, that the American people are given the opportunity to understand and comprehend what actually happened and how close we actually came to losing our democracy. And by the way, this was an incident rooted in racial superiority, in white nationalism. It was a display of white power. And so America needs to take a look at itself and understand where we are. And if we do that, then we'll be able to plot the way forward. Now, this investigation will reveal the facts to the American people. Also, it will help the Justice Department to narrow and focus its investigation on key components of the conspiracy. And I believe that they are doing that now. I believe that the Select Committee, January 6th Committee, working its investigation is offering details of that investigation to law enforcement, to the Justice Department, who is also doing their own investigation. And so ultimately, I believe that the Department of Justice will come forward with indictments against the key individuals who were responsible for directing this seditious conspiracy.
Congressman, on the Justice Department, there's been a lot of your colleagues on the Hill who've expressed some consternation against Merrick Garland and the Justice Department for not prosecuting many of the sort of contempt of Congress sort of citations that have been sent to the Justice Department they like not moving fast enough. What's your take on that? Do you think that Merrick Garland moving fast enough? Should he be moving faster? Is there anything that the people of Fox Soul should know about that?
Yeah, with Mark Meadows and Dan Scavino, the chief of staff to the president and the deputy chief of staff to the president, those two who had been subpoenaed to appear before the committee did not just simply ignore the subpoena, but they did try to work to at least put on a show of trying to work things out. They couldn't be worked out. And the fact that they are the closest aides to the president, and with executive privilege being a factor, we were in store for a lot of litigation pre-trial had the Justice Department invested its resources in indicting those two for contempt of Congress. Instead, it indicted Peter Navarro and
Steve Bannon.
Steve Bannon, who were not a part of the executive branch of government, have no claim of executive privilege. While at the same time, those two, Scavino and Mark Meadows, remain targets of the investigation for criminal prosecution. So I think a lot remains to be seen about what the Justice Department is going to do.
Thank you so much for joining us, Representative Johnson. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, the committee hearing will begin right here on Fox Soul.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. I'm Richard Fowler, along with Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey and Jehmu Greene. How are y'all doing?
We're holding out.
I'm ready. I'm ready.
Ready to rumble.
I'm ready.
Jehmu is ready for this committee to start. Before, what was so interesting about Congressman Hank Johnson at the bottom of that hour there was he was literally a survivor, and as he was talking about what happened, what came to me was the sort of iconic imagery of Lisa I can't even say her name. Blunchester from, yeah, there you go. Thank you, Dr. Quartey, from Delaware, praying, because that's how scary it was in that moment. They were literally afraid for their lives.
Yeah, I mean, I heard a lot of the same thing when I interviewed a number of members of the Congressional Black Caucus earlier this year on the eve of the insurrection anniversary, and I have a sense that this may be re-triggering for a lot of the staff and a lot of the members that were there, and a lot of people in Washington that had never seen this kind of violence on the steps of the Capitol before, certainly not in our lifetime. And so looks like we're about to get started.
The January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material presented during tonight's hearing. Thanks to everyone watching tonight for sharing part of your evening to learn the facts and causes of the events leading up to and including the violent attack on January 6, 2021. Our democracy, electoral system, and country. I'm Benny Thompson, chairman of the January 6, 2021 committee. I was born, raised, and still live in Bolton, Mississippi, a town with a population of 521, which is midway between Jackson and Vicksburg, Mississippi, and the Mississippi River. I'm from a part of the country where people justify the actions of slavery, the Ku Klux Klan, and lynching. I'm reminded of that dark history as I hear voices today try and justify the actions of the insurrectionists on January 6th, 2021. Over the next few weeks, hopefully you will get to know the other members, my colleagues up here, and me. We represent a diversity of communities from all over the United States, rural areas and cities, East Coast West Coast, and the Heartland, all of us have one thing in common. We swore the same oath. That same oath that all members of Congress take upon taking office and afterwards every 2 years if they are reelected. We swore an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. The words of the current oath taken by all of us that nearly every United States government employee takes have their roots in the Civil War. Throughout our history, the United States has fought against foreign enemies to preserve our democracy, electoral system, and country. When the United States Capitol was stormed and burned in 1814, foreign enemies were responsible. Afterward, in 1862, when American citizens had taken up arms against this country, Congress adopted a new oath to help make sure no person who had supported the rebellion could hold a position of public trust. Therefore, Congresspersons and United States federal government employees were required for the first time to swear an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath was put to test on January 6, 2021. The police officers who held the line that day honored their oath. Many came out of that day bloodied and broken. They still bear those wounds, visible and invisible. They did their duty. They repelled the mob and ended the occupation of the Capitol. They defended the Constitution against domestic enemies so that Congress could return, uphold our own oath, and count your votes to ensure the transfer of power, just as we've done for hundreds of years. But unlike in 1814, it was domestic enemies of the Constitution who stormed the Capitol and occupied the Capitol, who sought to thwart the will of the people, to stop the transfer of power. And so they did, so at the encouragement of the President of the United States. The President of the United States trying to stop the transfer of power, a precedent that had stood for 220 years, even as our democracy had faced its most difficult tests. Thinking back again to the Civil War in the summer of 1864, the President of the United States believed we would be doomed to his bid for re-election. He believed his opponent, General George McClellan, would wave the white flag when it came to preserving the Union. But even with that grim fate hanging in the balance, President Lincoln was ready to accept the will of the voters, come what may. He made a quiet pledge. He wrote down the words, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect. It will be my duty." Lincoln sealed that memo and asked his cabinet secretaries to sign it sight unseen. He asked them to make the same commitment he did, to accept defeat if indeed defeat was the will of the people, to uphold the rule of law, to do what every president who came before him did and what every president who followed him would do, until Donald Trump. Donald Trump lost the presidential election in 2020. The American people voted him out of office. It was not because of a rigged system. It was not because of voter fraud. Don't believe me? Hear what his former Attorney General had to say about it. I warn those who watching that this contains strong language.
No, just what I've been through. I had 3 discussions with the president that I can recall. One was on November 23rd, one was on December 1st, and one was on December 14th. And I've been through sort of the give and take of those discussions. And in that context, I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit. And, I didn't want to be a part of it, and that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did. I observed, I think it was on December 1st, that, how can you can't live in a world where the incumbent administration stays in power based on its view, unsupported by specific evidence, that there was fraud in the election.
Bill Barr, on Election Day 2020, he was the Attorney General of the United States, the top law enforcement official in the country, telling the president exactly what he thought about claims of a stolen election. Donald Trump had his days in court to challenge the results. He was within his rights to seek those judgments. In the United States, law-abiding citizens have those tools for pursuing justice. He lost in the courts, just as he did at the ballot box. And in this country, that's the end of the line. But for Donald Trump, that was only the beginning of what became a sprawling, multi-step conspiracy aimed at overturning the presidential election, aimed at throwing out the votes of millions of Americans, your votes, your voice in our democracy, and replacing the will of the American people with his will to remain in power after his term ended. Donald Trump was at the center of this conspiracy, and ultimately, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, spurred a mob of domestic enemies of the Constitution to march down the Capitol and subvert American democracy. Any legal jargon you hear about seditious conspiracy, obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to defraud the United States boils down to this. January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup, a brazen attempt, as one rioter put it shortly after January 6th, to overthrow the The violence was no accident. It represented Trump's last stand, most desperate chance to halt the transfer of power. Now, you may hear those words and think, this is just another political attack on Donald Trump by people who don't like him. That's not the case. My colleagues and I all wanted an outside independent commission to investigate January 6th, similar to what we had after 9/11. But after first agreeing to the idea, Donald Trump's allies in Congress put a stop to it. Apparently, they don't want January 6th investigated at all. And in the last 17 months, many of those same people have tried to whitewash what happened on January 6th, to rewrite history, call it a tourist visit, label it legitimate political discourse. Donald Trump and his followers have adopted the words of the songwriter, "Do you believe me or your lying eyes?" We can't sweep what happened under the rug. The American people deserve answers. So I come before you this evening, not as a Democrat, but as an American who swore an oath to defend the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't protect just Democrats or just Republicans. It protects all of us, we the people. And this scheme was an attempt to undermine the will of the people. So tonight, and over the next few weeks, we're going to remind you of the reality of what happened that day. But our work must do much more than just look backwards. Because of our democracy remains in danger, the conspiracy to thwart the will of the people is not over. There are those in this audience who thirst for power, but have no love or respect for what makes America great: devotion to the Constitution, allegiance to the rule of law, our shared journey to build a more perfect union. January 6th and the lies that led to insurrection have put 2.5 centuries of constitutional democracy at risk. The world is watching what we do here. America has long been expected to be a shining city on the hill, a beacon of hope and freedom, a model for others when we are at our best. How can we play that role when our house is in such disorder? We must confront the truth with candor, resolve, and determination. We need to show that we are worthy of the gifts that are the birthright of every American. That begins here, and it begins now, with a true accounting of what happened and what led to the attack on our Constitution and our democracy. In this moment, when the dangers of our Constitution and our democracy loom large, nothing could be more important. Working alongside the public servants on this dais has been one of the greatest honors of my time in Congress. It's been a particular privilege to count as a partner in this effort and to count as a friend the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney. She's a patriot, a public servant of profound courage, of devotion to her oath and the Constitution. It's my pleasure to recognize Ms. Cheney for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and let me echo those words about the importance of bipartisanship and what a tremendous honor it is to work on this committee. Mr. Chairman, at 6:01 p.m. on January 6th, after he spent hours watching a violent mob besiege, attack, and invade our Capitol, Donald Trump tweeted, but he did not condemn the attack. Instead, he justified it. "These are the things and events that happen," he said, "when a sacred landslide election victory is so unceremoniously and viciously stripped away from great patriots who've been badly and unfairly treated for so long." As you will see in the hearings to come, President Trump believed his supporters at the Capitol, and I quote, "We're doing what they should be doing." This is what he told his staff as they pleaded with him to call off the mob, to instruct his supporters to leave. Over a series of hearings in the coming weeks, you will hear testimony, live and on video, from more than half a dozen former White House staff in the Trump administration, all of whom were in the West Wing of the White House on January 6th. You will hear testimony that, quote, "The president did not really want to put anything out calling off the riot or asking his supporters to leave." You will hear that President Trump was yelling and, quote, "really angry at advisors who told him he needed to be doing something more." And aware of the rioters' chance to hang Mike Pence, the president responded with this sentiment, quote, "Maybe our supporters have the right idea. Mike Pence, quote, deserves it." You will hear evidence that President Trump refused for hours to do what his staff, his family, and many of his other advisors begged him to do: immediately instruct his supporters to stand down and evacuate the Capitol. Tonight, you will see never-before-seen footage of the brutal attack on our Capitol, an attack that unfolded while a few blocks away, President Trump sat watching television in the dining room next to the Oval Office. You will hear audio from the brave police officers battling for their lives and ours, fighting to defend our democracy against a violent mob Donald Trump refused to call off. Tonight and in the weeks to come, you will see evidence of what motivated this violence, including directly from those who participated in this attack. You will see video of them explaining what caused them to do it. You will see their posts on social media. We will show you what they have said in federal court. On this point, there is no room for debate. Those who invaded our Capitol and battled law enforcement for hours were motivated by what President Trump had told them, that the election was stolen and that he was the rightful president. President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack. You will also hear about plots to commit seditious conspiracy on January 6th, a crime defined in our laws as conspiring to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or to oppose by force the authority thereof. Multiple members of two groups, the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, have been charged with this crime for their involvement in the events leading up to and on January 6th. Some have pled guilty. The attack on our Capitol was not a spontaneous riot. Intelligence available before January 6th identified plans to, quote, invade the Capitol, occupy the Capitol, and take other steps to halt Congress's count of electoral votes that day.
Back. This is Fox Soul, not gavel-to-gavel coverage of the January 6th committee hearings.
Good night, soulmates, and welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. Now, so far, we've heard from Chairman Benny Thompson and Vice Chair Liz Cheney, who is the only congressman representing Wyoming, and she's currently embroiled in what seems to be a rather intense primary and will likely lose her primary based on recent polling. She's down 30 points. And one of the reasons why she's going to lose her primary, and I want to get the committee's, the panel sort of take on this, is because she stood up to Donald Trump and she stood up to Republicans. I mean, the first sort of step here was right after this Capitol insurrection on January 6th, Liz Cheney said that she was going to vote to impeach the president. At that point in time, the Republican caucus took away her leadership position. From there, they found a primary, somebody to challenge her in the primary. And now it seems as though this will likely be her last term in the House. But Jehmu, you're somebody who knows the halls of the United States Capitol very well. What do you think about Congresswoman Liz Cheney?
I mean, it cannot be lost on the significance of Congressman Cheney chairing this committee, of the statements she's already made about how broad this conspiracy was, how chilling this conspiracy was. This was the number 3 most powerful leader of the Republican Party. She was in leadership. And you have to also look at the fact that between 2017 and 2021, she voted with President Trump 93% of the time. She had a more committed record with President Trump than even his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, did when he was in Congress. And this is the woman who is saying that this conspiracy came very close to ending our democracy. The Republicans have come after her, and like you said, she might lose her election, but this committee being led by her, former Vice President Cheney's daughter, former leader of the Republican Party, this is not a partisan attack. This is bipartisan, trying to get to the bottom of what happened that day. And I don't think I ever thought I'd be shaking my head along with Liz Cheney, but that's exactly what I'm doing now, and have to applaud her for standing up.
Talking about shaking your head, Dr. Quartey, I mean, Jehmu brings up a really stellar point here. This idea that Liz Cheney, somebody who voted with the president more so than a lot of other members of Congress, now sits at a place where she could likely lose her seat because she's standing up for the democracy. I mean, this sort of puts our whole conversation into a really nice frame, right? Because it sort of says that this is how far Republicans are willing to go to preserve their argument, to preserve this sort of "Make America Great Again" mantra.
Well, some Republicans, but point taken, Richard, that this is a rare moment for America, a rare moment where we have seen a bona fide Republican. I mean, you don't get more Republican than Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, and the fact that she has been essentially ousted from leadership because she decided to put love for country above love for party. We can debate Liz Cheney's voting record, voting with Donald Trump 93% of the time, 93% of the time, oftentimes not in the interest of Black folks. Let's just call a spade a spade. But this moment here, the beginning of this hearing, is really off to a good start. We saw Chairman Benny Thompson, really harken back to, his upbringing in Mississippi, born and raised in Bolton, Mississippi, between Jackson and Vicksburg. And, we heard him sort of point out that he comes from a part of the country, that justified slavery, that justified the KKK, that justified the lynchings. And so I think, he's setting the stage and setting the table for what I hope will be a very compelling story that the American people can turn around.
Thank you, Dr. Quartey, for that. I think you're right. I think they're beginning to set the stage. The question is how the American people will take it. Let's get back to this hearing. Let's go back to Congressman.
His capacity as lawyer for former President Donald J. Trump and the Trump campaign in connection with Trump's failed effort at re-election in 2020. As you will see in great detail in our hearings, President Trump ignored the rulings of our nation's courts. He ignored his own campaign leadership, his White House staff, many Republican state officials. He ignored the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. President Trump invested millions of dollars of campaign funds purposely spreading false information, running ads he knew were false, and convincing millions of Americans that the election was corrupt and that he was the true president. As you will see, this misinformation campaign provoked the violence on January 6th. In our third hearing, you will see that President Trump corruptly planned to replace the Attorney General of the United States so the U.S. Justice Department would spread his false stolen election claims. In the days before January 6th, President Trump told his top Justice Department officials, quote, "Just say the election was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." Senior Justice Department officials, men he had appointed, told him they could not do that because it was not true. So President Trump decided to replace them. He offered Jeff Clark, an environmental lawyer at the Justice Department, the job of acting Attorney General. President Trump wanted Mr. Clark to take a number of steps, including sending this letter to Georgia and 5 other states, saying the U.S. Department of Justice had, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election. This letter is a lie. The Department of Justice had, in fact, repeatedly told President Trump exactly the opposite, that they had investigated his stolen election allegations and found no credible fraud that could impact the outcome of the election. This letter and others like it would have urged multiple states to withdraw their official and lawful electoral votes for Biden. Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue described Jeff Clark's letter this way, quote, "This would be a grave step for the department to take and could have tremendous constitutional, political, and social ramifications for this country." The committee agrees with Mr. Donoghue's assessment. Had Clark assumed the role of Attorney General in the days before January 6th and issued these letters, the ramifications could indeed have been grave. Mr. Donoghue also said this about Clark's plan.
And I recall toward the end saying, what you're proposing is nothing less than the United States Justice Department meddling in the outcome of a presidential election.
In our hearings, you will hear firsthand how the senior leadership of the Department of Justice threatened to resign, how the White House counsel threatened to resign, and how they confronted Donald Trump and Jeff Clark in the Oval Office. The men involved, including Acting Attorney General Jeff Rosen and Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue, were appointed by President Trump. These men honored their oaths of office, they did their duty, and you will hear from them in our hearings. By contrast, Jeff Clark has invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination.
We'll be back with more coverage of the January 6th committee hearings right here on Fox Soul.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Let's get right back inside the chamber.
That's what he articulated publicly, and I think that that's what he felt.
His fidelity to the Constitution was more important than his fidelity
to President Trump and his desire.
The oath he took. Yep.
Yes.
You'll also hear about a lawyer named John Eastman. Mr. Eastman was deeply involved in President Trump's plans. You'll hear from former Fourth Circuit federal judge Michael Luttig, a highly respected leading conservative judge. John Eastman clerked for Judge Luttig. Judge Luttig provided counsel to the vice president's team in the days before January 6th. The judge will explain how Eastman, quote, was wrong at every turn. And you will see the email exchanges between Eastman and the vice president's counsel as the violent attack on Congress was underway. Mr. Jacob said this to Mr. Eastman: "Thanks to your bullshit, we are under siege." You will also see evidence that John Eastman did not actually believe the legal position he was taking. In fact, a month before the 2020 election, Eastman took exactly the opposite view on the same legal issues. In the course of the Select Committee's work to obtain information from Mr. Eastman, we have had occasion to present evidence to a federal judge. The judge evaluated the facts, and he reached the conclusion that President Trump's efforts to pressure Vice President Pence to act illegally by refusing to count electoral votes likely violated 2 federal criminal statutes. And the judge also said this: if Dr. Eastman and President Trump's plan had worked, it would have permanently ended the peaceful transition of power, undermining American democracy and the Constitution. If the country does not commit to investigating and pursuing accountability for those responsible, the court fears January 6th will repeat itself. Every American should read what this federal judge has written. The same judge, Judge Carter, issued another decision on Tuesday night, just this week, indicating that John Eastman and other Trump lawyers knew that their legal arguments had no real chance of success in court, but they relied on those arguments anyway to try to, quote, overturn a Democratic election. And you will hear that while Congress was under attack on January 6th and the hours following the violence, the Trump legal team in the Willard Hotel War Room continued to work to halt the count of electoral votes. In our 5th hearing, you will see evidence that President Trump corruptly pressured state legislators and election officials to change election results. You will hear additional details about President Trump's call to Georgia officials, urging them to, quote, find 11,780 votes, votes that did not exist, and his efforts to get states to rescind certified electoral slates without factual basis and contrary to law. You will hear new details about the Trump campaign and other Trump associates' efforts to instruct Republican officials in multiple states to create intentionally false electoral slates and transmit those slates to Congress, to the Vice President, and the National Archives, falsely certifying that Trump won states he actually lost. In our final 2 June hearings, you will hear how President Trump summoned a violent mob and directed them illegally to march on the United States Capitol. While the violence was underway, President Trump failed to take immediate action to stop the violence and instruct his supporters to leave the Capitol. As we present these initial findings, keep 2 points in mind. First, our investigation is still ongoing, so what we make public here will not be the complete set of information we will ultimately disclose. And second, the Department of Justice is currently working with cooperating witnesses and has disclosed to date only some of the information it has identified from encrypted communications and other sources. On December 18, 2020, a group including General Michael Flynn, Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and others visited the White House. They stayed late into the evening. We know that the group discussed a number of dramatic steps, including having the military seize voting machines and potentially rerun elections. You will also hear that President Trump met with that group alone for a period of time before White House lawyers and other staff discovered the group was there and rushed to intervene. A little more than an hour after Ms. Powell, Mr. Giuliani, General Flynn, and the others finally left the White House, President Trump sent the tweet on the screen now. telling people to come to Washington on January 6th. Be there, he instructed them. Will be wild. As you will see, this was a pivotal moment. This tweet initiated a chain of events. The tweet led to the planning for what occurred on January 6th, including by the Proud Boys, who ultimately led the invasion of the Capitol and the violence on that day. The indictment of a group of Proud Boys alleges that they planned, quote, to oppose by force the authority of the government of the United States. And according to the Department of Justice, on January 6, 2021, the defendants directed, mobilized, and led members of the crowd onto the Capitol grounds and into the Capitol, leading to the dismantling of metal barricades, the destruction of property, the breaching of the Capitol building, and the assaults on law enforcement. Although certain former Trump officials have argued that they did not anticipate violence on January 6th, the evidence suggests otherwise. As you will see in our hearings, the White House was receiving specific reports in the days leading up to January 6th, including during President Trump's Ellipse rally, indicating that elements in the crowd were preparing for violence at the Capitol. And on the evening of January 5th, the president's close advisor, Steve Bannon, said this on his podcast.
All hell is going to break loose tomorrow. Just understand this. All hell is going to break loose tomorrow.
As part of our investigation, we will present information about what the White House and other intelligence agencies knew and why the Capitol was not better prepared. But we will not lose sight of the fact that the Capitol Police did not cause the crowd to attack.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be coming right back.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Let's go back inside the hearing.
Direct, very firm, and to Secretary Miller. Get the military down here, get the Guard down here, put down this situation, etc.
By contrast, here is General Milley's description of his conversation with President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, on January 6th.
He said, we have to kill the narrative that the Vice President is making all the decisions. We need to establish the narrative that that the president is still in charge and that things are steady or stable or what's that thing. I immediately interpret that as politics, politics, politics. Red flag for me personally, no action, but I remember it distinctly.
And you will hear from witnesses how the day played out inside the White House, how multiple White House staff resigned in disgust, and how President Trump would not ask his supporters to leave the Capitol. It was only after multiple hours of violence that President Trump finally released a video instructing the riotous mob to leave. And as he did so, he said to them, quote, "We love you, and you're very special." You will also hear that in the immediate aftermath of January 6th, members of the president's family, White House staff, and others tried to step in to stabilize the situation, quote, to land the plane before the presidential transition on January 20th. You will hear about members of the Trump cabinet discussing the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment and replacing the President of the United States. Multiple members of President Trump's own cabinet resigned immediately after January 6th. One member of the cabinet suggested that the remaining cabinet officers needed to take a more active role in running the White House and the administration. But most emblematic of those days is this exchange of texts between Sean Hannity and former President Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany. Sean Hannity wrote, in part, "Key now, no more crazy people, no more stolen election talk. Yes, impeachment and 25th Amendment are real. Many people will quit." Ms. McEnany responded in part, "Love that. That's the playbook." The White House staff knew that President Trump was willing to entertain and use conspiracy theories to achieve his ends. They knew the president needed to be cut off from all of those who had encouraged him. They knew that President Donald Trump was too dangerous to be left alone, at least until he left office on January 20th. These are important facts for Congress and the American people to understand fully. When a president fails to take the steps necessary to preserve our union, or worse, causes a constitutional crisis, we're at a moment of maximum danger for our republic. Some in the White House took responsible steps to try to prevent January 6th.
We're watching Fox Soul's coverage of the January 6th primetime hearing. This is the first day. What we know so far, and there's a couple of nuggets that's come out of this. I think the first nugget that we know is that a number of GOP members of Congress tried to get pardons from the president immediately after the January 6th Capitol invasion. We know that the sitting attorney general at the time, Bill Barr, told the president of the United States that this whole election lie was BS, was the actual words used by the AG. We know that people in the conservative media, including Sean Hannity, we just saw text from him saying that this is very bad. We know that Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff, went to the head of the head of the military of the United States and says, you have to make it seem as though the president was in charge. Now, while we knew some of this information before, hearing it all being put together, right, this committee is beginning to sort of create a storyline for the American people and a storyline for you out there watching that tells you just how dramatic January 6th and the days leading up to it was, which is sort of where we started our coverage a couple hours ago. Jehmu, I want to go to you because, I think you said this at the beginning, that this is all strung together right after sort of November 8th when Joe Biden was declared president. So what's your take so far?
Well, I am actually very impressed with Congresswoman Cheney really connecting those dots, because we were all watching television on January 6th and there were many people, I think, in the Black community, especially, who were not necessarily surprised that violence happened, but the images, they were so surprising. But listening to Congresswoman Cheney connect these dots from right after President Trump lost the election, how coordinated this was. I also can't just take away this feeling, the comparison of the calls for help that were coming as members of Congress were barricaded behind the doors, the calls that were going out to the military that went unanswered, the calls that were going to the White House that went unanswered. We just lived through hearing about calls from children in Uvalde that went unanswered by law enforcement down there, and thinking about the heroes, the Capitol police officers that day, but at the top echelons of our government, when the call for help came, those who had been conspiring to take away the free and fair election of Joe Biden were silent.
Dr. Quartey, now you're a resident of Washington, D.C. as well as I am, and we know that oftentimes when these type of large protests happen, the military and the National Guard and the Metropolitan Police Department are often very prepared. After the heinous murder of George Floyd, the National Guard, prior to protesters even gathering in the United States Capitol, the National Guard had already deployed assets. They had already had the Lincoln Memorial surrounded and the Washington Monument surrounded and the Capitol surrounded. What we heard from the Joint Chiefs of Staff Director, Mike Milley there, is this. We heard that there was no forward deployment of assets. There was no preparation for this idea that there was going to be mass protests on January 6th. We heard Steve Bannon say, there's going to be chaos in Washington. There was warnings, multiple warnings that there was going to be a bad situation. We already also know from many reporting, including the mayor of Washington, D.C. herself, saying she went to the White House and said, we need to deploy the D.C. National Guard because there will be a protest here. And all those calls fell on deaf ears, the deaf ears of Donald Trump.
I think part of what we're seeing here is the anatomy of the big lie, the fact that nearly everyone in Trump's inner circle, from former Attorney General Bill Barr, to senior advisor Jason Miller, to Trump's own daughter, Ivanka, everybody knew that he was lying about the 2020 election. And yet and still the Republican Party leadership for the past 17 months has lied to the American people and has acted like, hey, folks, nothing to see here, right? And so I think, what we're seeing here is the construction of the big lie, and hopefully we lean into it and we learn from it so that we don't repeat it. There's another wave of June primary elections coming up in the coming weeks. And there's the November election right around the corner. And, we can't, be so naive as to think that Republicans aren't going to try the Trump playbook here all over again.
They are.
I think that's right. And before we go to break, Jehmu, I want to just sort of double down on the point you just made, because even in this moment, as we're sitting here, the Capitol Police and National Guard are preparing for what will be the potential overturning of Roe v. Wade, because they know that there'll be possible violence in the United States Capitol, right? And so for all those folks watching at home who are saying, and I know folks have said, if this was the Black Lives Matter protests, the military would have been prepared. I want to tell you, you would have been right. And the fact that the military wasn't prepared for the Proud Boys and for Trump's protests has everything to do with the fact that the White House wanted this to happen under Donald Trump. There's no other way to put it. I mean, the reporting is very clear. Anyway, we've got to pay some bills here at Fox Soul. So we'll be right back after this break on our special coverage of the January 6th Gavel to Gavel.
Welcome to Fox Soul's special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing. I'm Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey, joined with Richard Fowler and Jehmu Greene. Now, I don't know what y'all are thinking, but as we're listening to this testimony, as we're listening to sort of the snippets from the depositions, I can't help but think that if these insurrectionists were Black folks, I'm not so sure if this testimony would be playing out the way that it is right now. I mean, what's your take, Jehmu? Do you think if these were Black folks, do you think that they would have been treated that first of all, we would have waited as long as we have been for any sort of accountability, any sort of recommendation to the Department of Justice to prosecute these folks?
Well, Dr. Quartey, we know what would have happened if these were Black folk, because President Trump's playbook, when the Black Lives Matter protest was taking place outside of the White House, he called up the military and asked them to shoot the protesters. So if the folks who had invaded the Capitol on January 6th had been Black people, the accountability would have been immediate. It would have been more people dead. I don't think there's any question when we had the overwhelming majority of Black Lives Matter protests going around the country after the murder of George Floyd. The fact that President Trump has, or former President Trump, denounced those overwhelmingly peaceful protests and lifts up those responsible for that attack. We had Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, no relation to me, spelled the same, but just today saying that the people who invaded the Capitol, that their rights, she said fragrantly, but she meant flagrantly, that their rights were being flagrantly invaded, that she's lifting up their rights. That would never happen with Black Lives Matter protesters. And there would have been more bloodshed.
One of the things that I mentioned at the top of the hour was the legislation that's sweeping the country, mostly through Republican-controlled legislatures, anti-protest legislation. I just want to connect the dots here between what we're hearing in this testimony around the Capitol insurrection, the voter suppression efforts, the very real and active voter suppression efforts that Jehmu has pointed out to us over the course of this hour and previous, and the effort afoot for the Republicans to also, pick and choose which protests and protesters are acceptable and who isn't an acceptable protester. Just to hear this testimony, Richard, how does that square with you in terms of the Republicans' willingness to just sort of dismiss what happened at the Capitol as just sort of a run-of-the-mill protest, as opposed to the more serious insurrection that it is?
I think that's actually the right question to ask. And I think it's really important that we talk about that, because the facts actually matter here. When these particular protests, the Proud Boys included, invaded the Capitol, they did it at a particular time, and the timing actually matters. There's not very many laws or federal codes that govern presidential elections. There really aren't. But there's one in particular, and the one is that there's a joint session of Congress must convene on January 6th at 1 o'clock to count the votes from the state electors, right? So listen, I'll tell you right now, when we saw the uprisings happen across the country, it was heartbreaking because many of it was happening in our communities. But anytime Republicans try to or anytime conservatives, for better word, try to sort of make this sort of equalize what was happening after George Floyd and what happened in the United States Capitol, the reason why those two things don't equate, is because of this. One was literally blocking the peaceful transfer of power, violating the one law that this country has when it comes to counting the presidential votes. And the other was about somebody's civil rights being infringed upon and people speaking out and expressing their First Amendment right to say that this person's civil rights should not have been infringed upon. So when Republicans try to make this argument, and I think you've seen it this whole time, at the beginning, when Speaker Pelosi said that we were going to have a January 6th committee, and the leader of the Republicans, Kevin McCarthy, said we should be talking about Antifa and we should be talking about Black Lives Matter, and it was all this whataboutism. The whataboutism in itself was flawed because it took away the fact that what the Proud Boys were doing, what Donald Trump was trying to do, was to violate the one federal law that we have about counting the votes for president of the United States. And in this case, that actually matters.
Can we just also point to one thing that just happened today? The Republican nominee for governor in Arizona attacked a man in a Black Lives Matter t-shirt today, attacked him. This is the new Republican Party. This is Donald Trump's Republican Party.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we know that there's a gubernatorial candidate in Michigan that just this morning was arrested and her home was searched due to their involvement with the January 6th insurrection. And so let's go back inside the committee chamber.
Changing to some of that West Karen door for backup.
Pursuant to the order of the committee of tonight, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Well, Richard and Dr. Quartey, it's still hard to see that footage. It is still really, really hard to see that footage. I can't imagine. I know we had Representative Hank Johnson on, and we were talking about all of the survivors that day, the heroes, the Capitol police officers, the staffers in the Capitol, the janitors, and seeing that footage, that must, I can't even imagine kind of the trauma that causes. And in many ways is why these hearings are so important, to remind the American people of just how close we came, when the president at the time was the chief instigator in getting us to this point. And we can't not, I think, talk about the fact, we talked about, what if these had been Black protesters? What if President Obama had faced the same situation that we saw happen on January 6th? I think the reaction would be quite different. Richard, I'd love to hear your thoughts on if this was an Obama administration.
Well, one, I think what we know from the Obama administration is they would have been prepared, and there would have definitely been a pre-deployment of National Guard. But I want to pick up on a point that you made, Jehmu, and I think it's so important, especially for this audience, to really talk about that. I think all of us have done work in the Capitol, if not Capitol Hill staffers. The people that maintain that Capitol each and every day, and who take pride in maintaining that Capitol, many of them look like the three of us. The people who work in the cafeteria, the people who work in the chief administrator's office of the Capitol, the people who maintain the Capitol ground, the people who work in the technology office at the Capitol, the people who maintain Capitol security. Many of them are African Americans. Many of them are my neighbors, right? And they live in Washington, D.C. They're part of the vibrant African American community in this city. And their lives were in danger as well during this January 6th. I think oftentimes we think about the members of Congress, but we have to remember this is a huge building, and maintaining that building and maintaining that Capitol is done by a majority African American staff. And they do it, and they go to work every day. And their lives are put in danger as well. And I'm sure we haven't heard a lot of their stories, but I'm sure they probably, just like we heard from the officer at the beginning of the show, their stories are just as sad, and their stories are just as powerful, and their stories matter as well when we think about the invasion of the United States Capitol. Dr. Quartey, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think this was really triggering. I think we'll find that this footage has been very triggering for folks that work at the Capitol, for Capitol Hill staff. I remember I was in Washington, D.C. on January 6th out of concern for some of my friends that were there in the Capitol. I got in my car and drove to the Capitol to try and find some way to usher them out of there, and was unsuccessful in being able to do that, but I had a chance to observe a lot of these insurrectionists that were hanging around the Capitol. And, I'll tell you this, they felt like zombies to me. I've never had that experience before. But if you looked in their eyes, it was almost like you didn't see anybody there. It was awfully strange. And so I can only imagine the people that are being triggered in some ways, watching this footage, having to relive this all over again.
Yeah, listen, I think that's right. And I think as we think about this, and what we know today is after they come back from this recess, they're going to begin to dig into the role that the Proud Boys played in this Capitol insurrection. And sort of connected to where you started this conversation, Jehmu, is the Proud Boys, they're really sort of what has become the new chapter of white supremacy in this country. I mean, for a long time, we thought that white supremacy had, the white hoods and they met in the back room. But now white supremacy, they wear khakis and collared shirts, right? And they show up at the Capitol and they invade the Capitol. So for those folks at home, I think we see it everywhere, right? Not only do we see it at the Capitol, we also see it in state capitals across the country. And we're not talking about folks invading the Capitol. We see it in the passage of legislation. We see it in Florida when they're banning books that, that say books that talk about what it is to be Black in America. So for those folks at home, like, how do you make that connection? And will the committee make that connection tonight between the Proud Boys invading the Capitol and legislation being passed in places like Texas and Oklahoma that says you can't read Toni Morrison's or you can't read Nikki Giovanni?
And certainly, I think we have to remember former President Trump's words. I think earlier I said, stand back, stand down. It was actually stand back, stand by. And so not only have we seen this growth with the Proud Boys, they had the full endorsement of the most powerful person on the planet when President Trump was in the White House. And they were taking their signals from him starting all the way back, if we look at 2017 and the protest in Charlottesville, Virginia. They had every belief that the president had their back because he was literally tweeting it, saying it, repeating it. And yes, we are now seeing some of the most significant charges come out of the Attorney General's office today, this week, for the leaders of the Proud Boys. But, quite frankly, we see the numbers. We just saw that footage of the hundreds
The committee will be in order. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us this evening to share their firsthand accounts of that terrible day. I know that some of the witnesses from our first hearing are in the room with us, along with some of the family members, friends, and widows of the officers who lost their lives as a result of the attack. Thank you all for being here for us and the American people. Officer Carolyn Edwards has been with the United States Capitol Police since 2017. On January 6th, Officer Edwards was assigned to the First Responder Unit, which serves as the first line of defense at the Capitol complex. She also served as a member of the Civil Disturbance Unit, a special subset of the uniformed division trained to respond to mass demonstration events. Officer Edwards is a graduate of the University of Georgia and currently is working on a master's degree in intelligence analysis from Johns Hopkins University. Nii Quartelai is an acclaimed filmmaker whose credits include documenting stories from war zones in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. On January 6th, Mr. Quartelai was working on a documentary about, quote, why Americans are so divided when Americans have so much in common, end quote. During that day, Mr. Quartelai interviewed and documented movements of the people around the Capitol, including the first moments of the violence against the Capitol Police and the chaos that ensued. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear and affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Without objection, the witness's statement will be included in the record. Pursuant to Section 5C8 of House Resolution 503, I recognize myself for questioning. As you saw just a few minutes ago, as the crowd advanced on the Capitol, Mr. Quartelai was a few yards away from Officer Edwards, taking footage of the Proud Boys as part of his work on a documentary film. Most of his footage has never been shown publicly before we shared it this evening. Officer Edwards, I'd like to start by asking if you could tell us why you believe it's important for you to share your story this evening with the committee and the American public. On the Capitol. Unfortunately, she was overrun. Please, your microphone. As the crowd advanced on the Capitol.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate it, and thank you to the committee for having me here to testify. I was called a lot of things on January 6, 2021 and the days thereafter. I was called Nancy Pelosi's dog, called incompetent, called a hero, and a villain. I was called a traitor to my country, my oath, and my Constitution. In actuality, I was none of those things. I was an American, standing face to face with other Americans, asking myself how many times, many times, how we had gotten here. I had been called names before, but never had my patriotism or duty been called into question. I, who got up every day, no matter how early the hour or how late I got in the night before, to put on my uniform and to protect America's symbol of democracy. I, who spent countless hours in the baking sun and freezing snow to make sure that America's elected officials were able to do their job. I, whose literal blood, sweat, and tears were shed that day defending the building that I spent countless holidays and weekends working in. I am the proud granddaughter of a Marine that fought in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir in the Korean War. I think of my papa often in these days, how he was so young and thrown into a battle he never saw coming and answered the call at a great personal cost. How he lived the rest of his days with bullets and shrapnel in his legs, but never once complained about his sacrifice. I would like to think that he would be proud of me, proud of his granddaughter that stood her ground that day and continued fighting, even though she was wounded, like he did many years ago. I am my grandfather's granddaughter, proud to put on a uniform and serve my country. They dared to question my honor. They dared to question my loyalty. And they dared to question my duty. I am a proud American, and I will gladly sacrifice everything to make sure that the America my grandfather defended is here for many years to come. Thank you.
Officer Edwards, your story and your service is important, and I thank you for being here tonight. Ms. Quickstead, I also like to ask you to introduce yourself. Can you tell us how you found yourself in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021?
Good evening, Chair and Madam Vice Chair. Thank you for the introduction. As stated, in the winter of 2020, I was working on a documentary. As part of that documentary, I filmed several rallies in Washington, D.C. on December the 11th and December the 12th, and I learned there would be a rally on the Mall on January 6th. So my 3 colleagues and I came down to document the rally. According to the permit of the event, there was going to be a rally at the Ellipse. We arrived at the Mall and observed a large contingent of Proud Boys marching towards the Capitol. We filmed them, and almost immediately I was separated from my colleagues. I documented the crowd turn from protesters to rioters to insurrectionists. I was surprised at the size of the group, the anger and the profanity. And for anyone who didn't understand how violent that event was, I saw it, I documented it, and I experienced it. I heard incredibly aggressive chanting, and I subsequently shared that footage with the authorities. I'm here today pursuant to a House subpoena. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Quested. The Select Committee has conducted extensive investigative work to understand what led the Proud Boys and other rioters to the Capitol on January 6th. We've obtained substantial evidence showing that the president's December 19th tweet calling his followers to Washington, D.C. on January 6th energized individuals from the Proud Boys and other extremist groups. I'd like to play a brief video highlighting some of this evidence.
My name is Marcus Childress, and I'm an investigative counsel for the Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol.
What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
white
like me to condemn? White supremacists and right Proud
Boys. Stand back and stand by.
After he made this comment, Enrique Terrio, then chairman of the Proud Boys, said on Parler, "Standing by, sir." During our investigation, we learned that this comment during the presidential debate actually led to an increase in membership from the Proud Boys.
Would you say that Proud Boys numbers increased after the stand back, stand by comment?
Exponentially. I'd say tripled probably, with the potential for a lot more eventually.
And did you ever sell any stand back and stand by merchandise?
One of the vendors on my page actually beat me to it, but I wish I would have made a stand back, stand by shirt.
On December 19th, President Trump tweeted about the January 6th rally and told attendees, "Be there, we'll be wild." Many of the witnesses that we interviewed were inspired by the president's call and came to D.C. for January 6th. But the extremists, they took it a step further. They viewed this tweet as a call to arms. A day later, the Department of Justice describes how the Proud Boys created a chat called the Ministry of Self-Defense Leadership Chat. In this chat, the Proud Boys established a command structure in anticipation of coming back to D.C. on January 6th. The Department of Justice describes Mr. Terrio coming into possession of a document called the 1776 Returns, which describes individuals occupying key buildings around the United States Capitol. The Oath Keepers are another group that the committee investigated.
You better get your ass to D.C., folks, this Saturday.
Yeah, if you don't, there'll be no more Republic. But we're not going to let that happen. It's not even an if. It's either President Trump is encouraged and bolstered and strengthened to do what he must do, or we wind up in a bloody fight. We all know that. The fight's coming.
The Oath Keepers began planning to block the peaceful transfer of power shortly after the November 3rd election. And according to the Department of Justice, Stuart Rhodes, the Oath Keepers leader, said to his followers that we were not going to get through this without a civil war. In response to the December 19th, 2020 tweet by President Trump, the Oath Keepers focused on January 6th in Washington, D.C. In response to the tweet, one member, the president of the Florida chapter, put on social media, "The president called us to the Capitol. He wants us to make it wild." The goal was for the Oath Keepers to be called to duty so that they could keep the president in power, although President Trump had just lost the election. The committee learned that the Oath Keepers set up quick reaction forces outside of the city in Virginia where they stored arms. The goal of these quick reaction forces was to be on standby just in case President Trump invoked the Insurrection Act.
Did the Oath Keepers ever provide weapons to members?
I'm going to decline to answer that and put them as grounds for due process grounds.
In footage obtained by the committee, we learned that on the night of January 5th, Enrique Tarrio and Stuart Rhodes met in a parking garage in Washington, D.C.
There's mutual respect there. I think we're fighting the same fight, and I think that's what's important.
The committee learned that the Oath Keepers went into the Capitol through the east doors in 2 stack formations. The DOJ alleges that one of the stacks went into the Capitol looking for Speaker Pelosi, although they never found her. As the attack was unfolding, Mr. Tarrio took credit. In documents obtained by the Department of Justice, Mr. Tarrio said in an encrypted chat, "Make no mistake, and we did this." Later on that evening, Mr. Tarrio even posted a video which seemed to resemble him in front of the Capitol with a black cape, and the title of the video was Premonition. The evidence developed by the Select Committee and the Department of Justice highlights how each group participated on the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. In fact, the investigation revealed that it was individuals associated with the Proud Boys who instigated the initial breach at the Peace Circle at 12:53 p.m. Within 10 minutes, rioters had already filled the Lower West Plaza. By 2 o'clock, rioters had reached the doors on the west and the east plazas. And by 2:13, rioters had actually broken through the Senate wing door and gotten into the Capitol building. A series of breaches followed. At 2:25 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors to the Rotunda. And then right after 2:40 p.m., rioters breached the east side doors near the Ways and Means room. Once the rioters infiltrated the Capitol, they moved through the crypt, the rotunda, the hallways leading to the House chambers, and even inside the Senate chambers.
Individuals associated with 2 violent extremist groups have been charged with seditious conspiracy in connection with the January 6th attack. One is the Oath Keepers. They are a group of armed anti-government extremists. The other group is the Proud Boys. They promote white supremacist beliefs and have engaged in violence with people they view as their political enemies. Members of both groups have already pled guilty to crimes associated with the January 6th attack. Mr. Quartey, as part of the documentary you've been filming, you gained access to the Proud Boys and their leader, Enrique Tarrio. Your crew filmed them in Washington, D.C.
Welcome back to Fox Soul's coverage of the January 6th primetime hearing. I'm Richard Fowler, along with Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey and Jehmu Greene. You've been watching this is about hour 2, what has been, by all measures, a very interesting and groundbreaking hearing. We found some new information. We also, to the conversation we were having the last time, we learned some new things. I remember what we were saying before, that the federal law says that 1 o'clock is when they have to count these votes. And the first breach of the Capitol happened just prior to a couple minutes before 1 o'clock. So think about the strategy behind that. And to make the connection here, and I think these connections are important, is one of these groups. First, we talked about the Proud Boys earlier in the show, but the other group, the Oath Keepers, another group, a white supremacist group, an armed white supremacist group, and how that sort of fast forwards to where we are right now. Right now in the United States Capitol, the United States Senate is debating how they will deal with the gun problem in this country. And one of the reasons why you will likely not see a ban on assault weapons is because of groups like the Oath Keeper and because of the groups that support them, like the National Rifle Association, also known as the NRA. So I want to take this to the panel, to Jehmu and Nii Quartelai, to talk about that, right? Because even though more and more African Americans are beginning to become gun owners, most African Americans want to see reasonable gun control. But because of white supremacist groups like the Oath Keepers and militia groups, what you see actually happening is they're not going to give us gun control, and we are the ones that will be harmed, like we saw at the Buffalo Tops grocery store. Jehmu?
Well, I mean, when you bring up Buffalo, I think we have to just continue to point to that shooting is a direct result of the same kind of forces that are pushing the big lie, that pushed the January 6th criminal invasion, that Congressman Benny Thompson said very clearly President Trump was at the center of.
That's right.
We'll be back with more coverage of the January 6th committee hearing on Fox Soul. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Fox Soul special coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Let's go back inside the hearing.
Police officer at the barriers, which subsequently breached. We then walk up and past a tactical unit preparing, and you see that in the film where the man questions their duty and their honor, and you see maybe a dozen Capitol Police putting on their riot gear.
So how would you describe the atmosphere at that time?
The atmosphere it seemed to be much darker. I make efforts to create a familiarity between myself and my subjects to make them feel comfortable. And the atmosphere was much darker at this day than had been in these other days. And there was also a contingent of Proud Boys that I hadn't met before from Arizona who appeared to wear these orange hats and had orange armbands.
So when the Proud Boys went back down the hill to the Peace Circle, did a larger crowd start together?
Well, no. First of all, we went round to the back and down the steps, and we took some photographs on the east side of the Capitol, and then we went for lunch. We went for tacos.
So, Mr. Quartey, you're a journalist, so you're careful to stick to things that you have observed. But what you've told us is highly relevant. Let me highlight a few key facts that you and others have provided the committee. First, there was a large group of Proud Boys present at the Capitol. We know that from multiple sources. You now estimate that there were around 250 to 300 individuals that you've testified. They weren't there for President Trump's speech. We know this because they left that area to march toward the Capitol before the speech began. They walked around the Capitol that morning. I'm concerned this allowed them to see what defenses were in place and where weaknesses might be. And they decided to launch their attack at the Peace Circle, which is the front door of the Capitol complex. It's the first security perimeter that those marching from the ellipse would have to come to as they moved toward the Capitol. The Peace Circle walkway was always where the thousands of angry Trump supporters would arrive after President Trump sent them from the ellipse. The Proud Boys timed their attack to the moments before the start of the joint session in the Capitol, which is also where President Trump directed the angry mob, "We fight like hell," end quote. He told them before sending them down Pennsylvania Avenue, right to where the Proud Boys gathered and where you were filming. Now, a central question is whether the attack on the Capitol was coordinated and planned. What you witnessed is what a coordinated and planned effort would look like. It was the culmination of a months-long effort spearheaded by President Trump. Mr. Quartey, thank you for your eyewitness account of the lead up to the breach of the Peace Circle. This brings us to a point in time where you and Officer Edwards were in close proximity. At this point, I reserve the balance of my time pursuant to 5 CFR Section 8 of House Resolution 503. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Officer Edwards, I want to start by thanking you for your service and thank you for your courage. Thank you for being here this evening. I know that it's not easy to relive what happened for you and for the officers behind you and for the family members of officers in the audience this evening. But it's really important for the country to have a full accounting and understand what happened. I want to start, Officer Edwards, with a short clip that shows the horrible moment when you were injured as the peace circle was breached. Officer Edwards, can you describe the crowd that had assembled at the Peace Circle as you and your fellow officers stood behind and guarded the bike racks at the Peace Circle?
Yes, so there were about, I want to say about 5 of us on that line. And there was our bike rack, and then at the bottom of the Pennsylvania Avenue walkway, or right by Peace Circle, there was another bike rack. And so the crowd had kind of gathered there. It was the crowd led by Joseph Biggs, and they were mostly in civilian clothes. There were some who had military fatigues on. We could see people with bulletproof vests on, things like that. They didn't seem, extremely cohesive, but they had gathered there in their outfits, but they had gathered there together, and Joseph Biggs started, he had a megaphone, and he started talking about, first it was things kind of relating to Congress, and then the tables started turning once the, what is now the Arizona group is what you said, the crowd with orange hats, they came up chanting F-U-C-K, Antifa, and they joined that group. And once they joined that group, Joseph Biggs' rhetoric turned to the Capitol Police. He started asking us questions like, you didn't miss a paycheck during the pandemic. Mentioning stuff about our pay scale was mentioned. And, started turning the tables on us. And I've worked, I can, conservatively say probably hundreds of civil disturbance events. I know when I'm being turned into a villain, and that's when I turned to my sergeant and I stated the understatement of the century. I said, Sarge, I think we're going to need a few more people down here. And so after that, I think they started conferring. They went a little silent. They started conferring among each other. I saw the person now identified as Ryan Samsel. He put his arm around Joseph Biggs, and they were talking, and then they started approaching the first barricade. They ripped the first barricade down, and they approached our bike racks. At that time, we started holding on, grabbing the bike racks. There weren't many of us, so I grabbed the middle between 2 different bike racks, and I wasn't under any pretense that I could hold it for very long, but I just wanted to, make sure that we could get more people down and get our CDU units time to answer the call. So we started grappling over the bike racks. I felt the bike rack come on top of my head, and I was pushed backwards, and my foot caught the stair behind me, and my chin hit the handrail, and then at that point I had blacked out, but the back of my head clipped the concrete stairs behind me.
And you were knocked unconscious, is that right, Officer Edwards?
Yes, ma'am.
But then when you regained consciousness, even with the injuries, you returned to duty, is that right?
Yes, ma'am. At that time, adrenaline kicked in. I ran towards the West Front, and I tried to hold the line at the Senate steps at the Lower West Terrace.
You are watching some very brave testimony from Carolyn Edwards, a United States Capitol Police officer. And we're going to a quick break, and we'll be coming right back. This is the Fox Soul Special coverage of the January 6th committee hearing.
Welcome back to Fox Soul special coverage of the January 6th hearings. And before we get back to what has just been incredibly compelling testimony from Officer Carolyn Edwards and such powerful shots of her fellow officers sitting in support behind her, I can't help but think about what got us to this point with what we heard from Congressman Benny Thompson when he said President Trump at the time was at the center of this criminal conspiracy. President Trump, the person who wanted and called for the execution of 5 young Black and Latino innocent boys. President Trump, who told 3 members of Congress, women of color, to go back to their crime-infested countries. President Trump, who launched his presidential campaign by calling Mexicans rapists. And we recently learned that as the white supremacists were marching in Charlottesville back in 2017, all of these dots being connected, the work that he did to keep Blacks out of his buildings when he was a developer in New York, all of these dots are connected to lead us to a place where you've got white supremacy organizations, very coordinated, very broadly, and in Cheney's own words, chillingly conspiring to steal an election. There are still people out there who say, is President Trump racist? Richard, what say you?
Listen, I mean, look, there's no question that this president...
Former President Trump.
Yes, former President Trump. There's no question that this president toys and tangles in the deep, deep, deep ocean of white supremacy. There's no question about it. And I think what makes this even more severe is that during this Capitol insurrection, during January 6th, when he had an opportunity to do something, right, as the leader of the free world and the commander-in-chief of the United States military, it took him hours to do something. So he was so willing, he wanted to win and stay in power so bad that he was willing to put the entire United States democracy in jeopardy to do so. And what makes this so difficult for me to stomach as a journalist is that for President Barack Obama, every single thing that he did was scrutinized, right? Down to when he wore a brown suit was scrutinized. Whereas when you think about President Trump and you put it into context, for hours, we don't know what the president was doing as the United States Capitol was invaded. And there's literally people, sitting members of the United States Congress, who will not hold him accountable for that, but they're willing to talk about Barack Obama in his tan suit. It's a shame.
What we do know from the testimony of tonight's hearings is that when President Trump said, stand back, stand by, he became the chief recruiter for the Proud Boys. Their membership increased. What did we hear tonight? 3 times that this was the direct result of words come out of his mouth and white supremacists, the ranks grow. I know that we talked early on, Dr. Quartey, about all of the issues facing Americans right now, from gas prices to mass shootings every single day, another mass shooting. Do you think the members of this committee have done their job to put this back front and center in front of Americans who are also right now fighting for their voting rights against 50% of the people who have won Republican primaries to date believe the big lie?
Well, I certainly believe that the January 6th Commission has a very tall order, and we will find out in the coming weeks whether or not they were able to hit their mark in terms of connecting the dots. That's really what this is all about, is connecting the dots for ordinary people that may not be watching these hearings each and every day and may not be watching them for hours and hours, but their job is to quickly and succinctly connect the dots for the American people. I think President Trump, former President Trump, wasn't just a recruiter for the Proud Boys. He was chief marketing officer, apparently, because somebody got the bright idea to take his stand back, stand by call to action and merchandise that, right? I mean, the fact that they established a command structure. I mean, these folks were very, very, very organized, right? And the last point that I'll make is, I can't watch this and not think about Elon Musk's, being on the cusp of potentially owning Twitter. And the fact that Elon Musk can say, that he would be willing to let Donald Trump back onto Twitter, I don't see how anybody in their right mind can hear this testimony and turn around and say, let's put him back on one of the world's biggest platforms to weaponize that some more.
Dr. Quartey, that's why I don't own a Tesla and I don't plan on buying one anytime soon. Anyway, that's all you're getting from me tonight. We'll be right back after this break as we continue our coverage of the January 6th committee hearings. Welcome back to our live coverage of the January 6th committee hearing, and we'll go right back to the chambers.
And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Did you recall President Trump mentioning going to the Capitol during his speech?
Oh, yeah. So that's one of my disappointments. He said he was going to go with us, that he was going to be there.
I know why I was there, and that's because he called me there, and he laid out what is happening in our government. He laid it out.
But I remember Donald Trump telling people to be there, right? I mean, to support. So you mentioned that the president asked you. Do you remember a specific message?
Basically, yeah, he asked for us to come to D.C., that big things are going to happen.
What got me interested, he said, I have something very important to say on January 6th or something like that, is what got me interested to be there.
Trump has only asked me for two things. He asked me for my vote, and he asked me to come on January 6th.
When the committee reconvenes next week, we're going to examine the lies that convinced those men and others to storm the Capitol, to try to stop the transfer of power. We're going to take a close look at the first part of Trump's attack on the rule of law, when he hit the fuse that ultimately resulted in the violence of January 6th. Without objection, and with that, the committee stands adjourned.
At the beginning of this, I said that this committee had a tall order, and tonight was like no other night in American history. We got a chance to see this committee really lay out the facts. Let's get a take from Jehmu. What was your take from tonight's hearing?
Certainly the dots that we saw Representative Cheney start to lay out almost like a lawyer, a prosecutor in a criminal defense trial, really connecting the dots starting even before the November 2020 election, when President Trump started to craft the idea around the big lie. And immediately after he lost by hundreds of thousands of votes, millions of votes to President Biden, this big lie and really tapping into his hardcore MAGA supporters, the Proud Boys, where he was recruiting from, just each of those dots that led to January 6th. This was a conspiracy. And I think that they did start to really lay out a good case. And at the same time, what I would like to see is some really strong connections coming out as we move into the next set of hearings that show how now decisions in states across the country are being made to continue to carry out this criminal conspiracy and take away our freedom to vote, take away our rights across the board, and how also it is connected to the shooting in Buffalo, where we lost 10 Black citizens because of, again, all of this disinformation that President Trump was at the center of. So a lot of dots connected tonight. I think a lot more still to be connected. And that story, the reminder, the pain, the heroism that we saw reflected through the officer and the documentarian, really, I think is key. We can't forget what happened on January 6th. And those images were extremely powerful, Richard.
Thank you. Dr. Quartey, at the beginning of this, you said that this committee had a tall order. Did they get the order right?
I think they're on track to getting the order right if they keep this up. You know, look, I think one of the big headlines from this, and, you know, take it from the movie Ghost, Molly, you in danger, girl. You know, I think for Americans that are watching this, I think we can't help but walk away after hearing some of this testimony, feeling that the country is in more grave danger than perhaps we previously thought. I thought the committee made good use of some of the real people stories. I think those real people stories will play well, particularly on social media, little sound bites from various folks that were engaged on the front lines of that insurrection. And it's also very clear that Make America Great Again, I think all of our viewers know that was a dog whistle. You know, Make America Great, you know, we want to turn the clock back to when it wasn't so great for so many of us. Just how that was a dog whistle, so was the Stand Back, Stand By. That was also a dog whistle. And so really looking forward to Monday, where we get to learn a little bit more about how folks were radicalized by a sitting president of the United States to take part in the planning of and execution of an insurrection like we haven't seen in U.S. history. I look forward to delving into it on KBLA Talk 1580 on A More Perfect Union on Sunday. And I'm sure we will continue to follow this here at Fox Soul.
I will definitely continue to follow us here at Fox Soul. Some of the big takeaways for me is that they're beginning to connect the dots. The question is were the American people watching? We want to thank you at home for watching and trusting us with the coverage of the January 6th committee. My name is Richard Fowler, along with Dr. Nii Quartelai Quartey and Jehmu Greene. We want to thank you for joining us tonight and trusting us with your coverage. I'm Richard Fowler, and I'll see you next time. Good night, everybody.